After 7 years of mourning and encouraged by his teenage son to find a new wife, widower Aoyama seeks the advice of a colleague within the film company for which they both work. Together, they hit upon the perfect plan, staging an audition for actresses, ostensibly for a new feature project, but in reality, hoping to find the new ideal woman to share Aoyama's life. While interviewing a series of candidates, the lonely older man becomes enchanted by Asami, a quiet young woman who is immediately responsive to his charms. The two seem to instantly fall for each other, but things take a very dark and twisted turn, or three, as we discover Asami isn't all she seems to be. One of the titles that launched the international J-horror wave of the early 21st century, Audition exploded onto the festival circuit to a chorus of awards and praise, catapulting director Takashi Miike into the consciousness of cinephiles around the world and paving the way for future off-kilter offerings as Ichi the Killer, Visitor Q, and Happiness of the Katakuris. Playing with temporal constructs and toying with audience genre expectations, it's a slow burn, but what's that bag doing there? And concluding with one of the most agonizing climaxes in recent memory. The phrase, kitty, 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 will haunt your nightmares for weeks. Hard to believe it's already been a quarter century since Takashi Miike exploded cinema with his amazing film Audition. And we've got an amazing panel to chat about it with me. So I'm going to bring everybody in. And let's say hello to John Riskasich.
Hi.
Michelle Kisner.
Hello.
Katie Glidewell, a.k.a. the bald in front.
Hello.
But you are less and less bald all the time.
I know. Look at that.
Raul Benitez.
Hey, everyone.
And just down the street in Chicago, Dominic Conti.
Hi there.
And we are here to chat about Audition from 1999, celebrating its 25th anniversary. Thanks for coming on shore, buddy, and a welcome. So, as is our wont, let's go ahead and discuss our origin stories, how people came to Audition for the first time. Dominic, let's go ahead and kick things off with you. Where do you think you came across this film for the first time?
Very simply, just all the reviews. I just started reading reviews about it, and they were all, in addition to being positive, it just kind of sparked my interest into like this particular filmmaker in particular. And I know he's made a lot of films, but like this particular film. And so after I read about 10,000 of them, I thought, all right, I better watch this thing.
Where'd you see it?
Oh, rented it. I don't remember exactly when, but yeah, I rented it, I think, back in the days of like DVDs.
Cool. Raul, how about you?
I actually saw it at the Gene Sisco Film Center when it got they had that U.S. release after it did his little film festival run here. I saw it on a date.
This is one of the great date movies.
I also never owned a media copy of it ever.
You've only ever seen it in the theater?
Yep. And when it ever comes up on TV.
And Katie, how about you?
I heard about this on AMC, before you had to buy every channel and all that stuff. AMC had the 100 scariest movies of all time.
Uh-huh.
And they talked about Audition. I'd never heard of it. And all these people were raving about it. So I went to Borders. I'm really aging this story. I went to Borders and I picked up a copy and I watched it. And it took me a couple times to watch it because it definitely takes its time getting to where it gets scary. And yeah, it blew me away. But then I saw it at the Music Box and I'm like, this is a film that needs to be experienced in a theater. You need to have that captive audience experience because like me, I stopped it so many times because I was just kind of bored. Like I didn't know where this was going. And then getting to the parts where it made it famous and it's like, okay, now I understand.
Michelle.
So when Audition came out, was it 1999? I was like 18. I still am in this phase, but I was in I have to see every single Japanese film that comes out phase. But it was hard to get them here, especially because I was like in the middle of nowhere, Texas. So there was no, cool art house theaters or anything like that for me to see it. So I had an eBay bootleg guy and I got it from my eBay bootleg guy. And it was a DVD, no extras, and some of the worst subtitles ever. In fact, when I rewatched it, with like a legit release, I was like, the story seems so much richer to me because the things people were saying made sense. But it's still, I had no idea about the twist, and I was like, oh wow, Takashi Miike has changed gears and made a romance film. How interesting! This is like so unlike his other work. And then about halfway through, I was like, oh, okay, now we're getting into Miike territories happening again, and it blew me away. And I was also loved springing it on my friends, which I did all the time, because this is back in the day when social media kind of wasn't a thing really, and people didn't have like a consciousness about Audition. Like pretty much everybody knows Audition from the twist, and I loved springing this movie onto people. It was hilarious.
And John.
Yeah, I saw this when it first came out. It was at a time in my life where I was watching pretty much anything that came in the movie theaters, and walked into it blind. I knew the title. I saw the poster. And after watching it, which happened to be at night, I had to walk to the coffee shop that I was going to afterwards. And I was like, what was that? I didn't see it again probably for another 15 years. But it always had like a real impactful impression on me. But the details disappeared. So it was just like, I remember a really horrible ending to that. Honestly, it felt like kind of like maybe a pre-Me Too movie later on, once there were words for it. It's taken on different meanings over the years. Each viewing, I see different things in it, and there's a lot more sophistication to it than I thought initially.
Similar to you, Michelle, this is one that somebody had mentioned, like, you got to see this. And I think it was one of the first bootlegs. I got it on VHS, and I still have it. It's like, like marker on the side. Terrible subtitles that you could barely read, and you had to get really close to the TV to see what they were saying. And like watching it later, I think Arrow's Blu-ray release is the one I caught up with it again. And it's just like, oh, that's what they're saying. And, oh, this makes a lot more sense. And because I think similar to you, Katie, I was kind of like, I'm not sure about this story. It seems like a lot of time goes by before you get that first jump scare. But that's a great jump scare because you've been kind of lulled into this place of, oh, it's a drama. It's a, exploration of, the dynamics between men and women and, older and younger. And then there's a bag on the floor that starts rolling around. You're like, wait a minute, hang on. I'm really glad that we're all kind of congregating together and that we all kind of came at it from different places. Sounds like you were familiar, Michelle, with Miike, because this was the first of his films I had ever seen before. What was your intro to Miike?
This was like way in the past, like in my early, film days. Like I always was in the film, but not to the degree I am now, obviously. But I just was like a movie fan, right? I just loved movies, and a lot of his were easier to get than other Japanese directors. He was so mainstream there that he also, I feel like, has a Western style sometimes to some of his work that would appeal maybe more to Western audiences. So a lot of his stuff seemed to just come over here more often. So that's why I just saw more of his work. I don't remember, maybe Ichi the Killer, maybe.
Well, this film was kind of the introduction on the international stage for him. He had this premiered at the Rotterdam Film Festival in 1999 alongside Dead or Alive and the final film in the Black Society trilogy, Ley Lines. And so suddenly he was a huge superstar on an international stage, and people started associating him with these, the horror and the violence, because I think Ichi the Killer was the next big release that he had. And so people were like, okay, Audition and Ichi, that's who Miike is. But, as several of you pointed out, he actually has a huge body of work and doesn't do a ton of horror, but even though those are the things that he's known for. Raul, when you saw the premiere at Gene Siskel, what was the general impression from the audience?
Funny enough, there's probably like 10 people in the audience from what I remember. There wasn't a big audience. I knew a little bit about him going into it, and then my girlfriend at the time, who I took on a date to this thing, had no clue. I just told her it was a Japanese art house film. And so she was like, great. And then when we walked in, they had the poster in the lobby. She was like, what are we getting into? And so I didn't really know much about it. As you guys know, it takes a long time to build up into the horror aspect of it. I know if I remember correctly, my girlfriend at the time, she really felt that actually she kind of loved it because it was kind of like this, in a way, man-hating film where she kind of exacts revenge on these men in a way, and the revenge is informed by what happened to her as a child. If I remember, there was a lot of talk in the lobby about it afterwards because I think most people at the time that saw it in the theater went in without knowing anything about it.
Yeah, sure.
And back then there was you had to really search for like stuff that was playing at film festivals. Not now, like everybody covers film festivals, so you get a lot of coverage of films. But in those days, there wasn't that much coverage, so there wasn't a lot to go off of back then. So there was a lot of talk. If I remember, there was a lot of talk about the film afterwards, especially what I consider the last 20 minutes of horror. That's probably one of the greatest of all time.
For sure. Yeah, I want to say I probably didn't hear about it until like 2003, maybe 2004. We talked a little bit about, but let's go ahead and just kind of like lay out what the premise of the film is. We have a businessman who is a widower. His wife's been dead for 7 years, and he and his friend decide that they are going to get him a new girlfriend. And the way they're going to do this is by holding fake auditions for this movie. Actually, they're not fake auditions, they're legit auditions, but he's in there looking for his next partner, looking for somebody who can be the love of his life. And Asami is the young ballet dancer who is toying with the idea of being an actress. And she comes in and there's sparks there, and he asks her out on a date and they start having a relationship. But then we find out that she is not as she seems. And he certainly, his means of getting to meet her is not entirely upfront either. So there's a lot of kind of examination of duplicity and lies and honesty and backstory and things like that. One of the things that I really want to talk about is how there is a very specific Japanese lens. I think this film is looking at the world through. It feels like a very Japanese experience. And yet there's a universality to it that allows audiences to tap into. Now, part of that's the horror aspects, because we can all imagine what it would be like to, have needles sticking in you. But there's something about that relationship aspect that I think really resonated with audience as well. Would anybody like to speak to that?
The Japanese aspect of it, I feel like Japanese men prefer a demure, has traditional values. Even with the youth in Japan now, I feel like still there is an obsession with traditional culture. The idea that the protagonist has an audition to replace his dead wife. Now, to his credit, a lot of times, like you hear about, a man, his wife will die. He will literally find a new wife and get married like 6 months later because he cannot exist without a woman doing the emotional and manual labor for him. So he basically is like getting a new maid. To his credit, to this main character's credit, which I also think makes this film more interesting and nuanced, is that he actually legitimately mourns the loss of his wife to the point where he can't date anymore and he won't find anybody else, and everybody in his life is like begging him to find someone because he's been alone for so long. Now, the reasons they tell him to find someone range from you seem lonely to you can't take care of yourself, you need somebody to take care of you, you look tired because you're having to do everything instead of your wife taking emotional labor. But to his credit, he doesn't seem as misogynistic. Later in the film, they kind of show you his true nature. At the beginning of the film, he just seems like a guy that lost his wife. It's years later. I want to find love. I'm lonely. I need a companion. So I think that's the more Japanese lens of the idea of finding a traditional style like wife. And then the universal lens is, everybody has experienced at one point in their life trying to date, right? And trying to find somebody. And essentially, this kind of predates Tinder and stuff, to where it's almost the exact same thing where you're getting headshots of everybody and you're literally swiping through and looking at their and they have their attributes listed like in a nice little neat list, and you're literally shopping for like people, right? That's what Tinder is. So in a way, I think it's kind of prescient that it kind of predicted the way that love would become transactional. I feel like this movie is so smart for the way that it sets up their relationship and then completely pulls the rug out halfway through. But I absolutely loved the opening, like half of it. And I know a lot of people tend to be like, especially if they've seen it before, they're like, oh, the first half's boring. But I think the first half, once you've seen the entire thing, it's like chilling, all the foreshadowing that's going on. And like you catch so much more in that first half when you rewatch it, and how genius the setup of this film is.
What you just articulated is, I think we all come to this movie hearing about, oh man, it's really disturbing, and there's this, amazing shock, and there's a twist, and all of that is way down the line. But like you, I really appreciate the opening 2/3 so much more now, because I'm not carrying the weight of the big horror at the end. Like, you're actually looking at what this is examining, which is not just a shock and horror. There's a real struggle going on in terms of, how do I be authentic in a relationship and yet doing it in a completely inauthentic way?
Mm-hmm.
Dominic, did you have something you want to add?
I thought Michelle made a good point about this guy. He is awful. His behaviors are awful, but you do see good in him. And at least there was good in the past. And it makes it all the more horrific when later on that torture scene happens. Because if he was beyond despicable, and say like his friend is more sort of a mirror image of him, but a worse one. So his friend is worse. So if something was happening to that friend, it almost would be less horrific, more of an Ichi the Killer style violence. Then like this Audition movie just really struck me as something that could happen. And it happened to a guy who was like kind of like he was in a gray area. And it just was really, really tough to see that happen to this guy who could have gone another way. He legitimately could have been better and done something else that was better. And maybe if this didn't happen, he would have. But then maybe someone else would spin it that he gets his just desserts. I'm not sure.
The way I look at it is the whole thing is based on a lie, because the audition is a lie. And then she kind of lies back. So the whole relationship is based on a lie, because he doesn't really tell her about his ex-wife until she finds out about it later, leading to that end of the movie.
John?
The title of the movie is actually got kind of a double meaning, because in a way I think she was auditioning him for her next victim to some extent. And it's not so obvious the first time you watch it, but I definitely was picking that up the most recent viewing I was watching. Also, something I wanted to mention, they were trying to convince him to get another wife and stuff. And he reaches out to his friend, who I think his friend was actually, a good, solid friend who was like looking out for his best interests and stuff. And not necessarily a despicable person, just kind of jaded and in the system and stuff. But he suggested, arranged marriage, which evidently is a more prominent thing in Japan. And so the context of this whole thing comes from a world where, you might just have somebody set up a marriage for you. And I think that's an important part of it.
The idea of the audition, I mean, that's basically what any date is, right? When you're sitting down with somebody, you're like, okay, are you going to be able to play this role of my partner? Are you going to be able to play this role of my lover, of my companion? Like, are we going to be able to go on trips together? Like, that's what any date is. And there's a part of me that, it sees maybe even a commentary, because J-horror tends to talk about technology a lot. Technology is often in service of efficiency and convenience. And that's what this audition is. It's a convenient way for him to have a bunch of women paraded in front of him. He can ask questions and then go, okay, now we can narrow down the field instead of having to do the labor of asking somebody out and encountering somebody. There's a commentary there on convenience. And yes, when we go on dates, do we put all of our warts on the table right away? No, of course not. We will tell the best version of ourselves. We'll give that audition. And then later you'll find out that, oh, I'm also this, and this. But it's trying to get through the door. Like, that's what auditions are about. And a couple people on this panel are actors, so we know what that's like.
You mentioned a few times about how long it takes for the the really gruesome body horror events to go on and the twists to go on in this movie. And when people started talking about that, I started thinking about Wolf Creek, which really takes a good chunk of time before that's at least 2/3 of the movie before anything really, really gets grim. But it's all the grimmer for me, kind of going back to what I said, because you watch those kids fall in love, and they have what could have been a very wonderful vacation, and then that just huge turn. And this movie is something like that. And frankly, I think I wouldn't have minded if I knew a little less about this movie going into it and had that big turn happen for me.
Yeah, I went in pretty cold. It sounds like a lot of other people went in without knowing much about it, and so it got to kind of just work its way through. Aoyama, our businessman, he has relationships with different women in his life. We see reflections of his housekeeper, the secretary, his son's girlfriend, and all of those women start to kind of show up toward the end in this kind of weird cycle. Does anybody want to talk about that? Certainly that main character and what, if anything, that Miike might be saying about it.
So I do find that part extremely interesting because it doesn't come into play until the end when the last 20 minutes where the film starts veering into surrealism. But I feel like many men, and this also goes like opposite way too. He has like a tier system for how much he respects a woman. And depending on where she is in his life, according to him, he gives them more respect or less respect. Perhaps the ending is a little bit of a revenge for that. Like, I don't want to say like a good for her kind of revenge, because I don't think he's a bad guy. I think the society that he lives in has kind of made him a bad guy a little bit. Like, I'm not saying that he has no control over his actions, but I feel like just the way society is, the way he views women is acceptable, and he's never really thought any other way. But there's a point where it kind of goes between all the different women giving him oral sex, and it goes between like Asami, the keeper, even his son's girlfriend is in there too. And I don't even, and there's probably like a little bit of like he was sexually attracted to his son's girlfriend. Because, and also in Japan, the age of consent's a little lower too. And there's actually kind of a little bit of an issue with like, dating older men, dating really young girls. So I think it was kind of like his psyche and this guilt of him like compartmentalizing women in different like respect tiers. And I love the way that it cuts between all the women. And, that part is just interesting because it never signals that it's going to be surreal at any point. It just starts doing it. And the entire film is organic and realistic up until the last 20 minutes where it's like 2 dream sequences in one. I love that Miike like does the double wake up. Like you're like, oh, he got away. Oh, he didn't get away again. I love that. I was like, yeah, that's like fucked up, like get her hopes up twice. Dang, that's messed up. I just love the way that it explores what men think of women and what would happen if that was kind of like turned back on them in a violent kind of way. I'm not saying at all for anybody in the audience that he deserved it. I'm just saying in the context of the film, it's almost his like penance for the way that he has treated women or thought about women his entire life. And he just picked the wrong one to mess with that one time.
Adding on to that, I also love the fact that not only does it go into his subconscious regarding the women in his life and how he may have used them, because I always felt like there was something going on with the secretary and she admits to that, but also like it goes into what Asami had endured as when she was a child, and also like the burns and just on a personal note, I had forgotten about that scene, and I got this drink when that was going on. So when she was throwing up and feeding it to the guy in the bag, having this, it took me a good 45 minutes before I could drink this again because I almost spit this out of my mouth. But that was just something I'd never seen before. Like just the juxtaposition of like what she had gone through and then what he had put women through, that you're trying to like, he's like making the audience understand that he isn't a bad guy, but he has possibly done some bad things, and he definitely has that feeling of guilt about it.
John, you mentioned the idea of her auditioning him to be her next victim. I'm going to take a less kind of cynical tack on it, and that she's really wants him to turn out to be the one.
Oh,
I don't think she's going out there looking for the next person to kill or to
I think they're
maim.
one and the same. The person that's going to be devoted to her is also her next victim. She demands a devotion to her that cannot even include his love for his son.
Right.
So that relationship's never going to work out, except in the sorts of constraints that she puts on it with, getting rid of their feet and stuff.
Like presenting an unrealistic expectation,
So I mean, she doesn't really necessarily see it as victimhood or whatever. She sees it as, oh, well, this is the relationship. We're moving towards that. Victim, not victim, I don't know.
Do we have any guesses as to who our guy in the bag is?
Actually, it's her stepfather. I was curious about that. I had
I thought the stepfather was the guy who was the piano, the ballet teacher.
No, that's her uncle, I believe.
Because I've also heard that it's the studio guy, the one who disappeared from the music studio, the one that she said was her agent at the audition. I've heard that positive that he's the guy in the bag.
Going off what John was saying, I think with her, she's like basing these relationships on her past trauma from her childhood, and I think she equates pain with love, and so that's how she's acting it out. And so she's torturing these guys because she sees that as love, because that's what happened to her, was she got tortured, and so that's basically what she's kind of just continuing that process in her mind, that torturing these guys means love, and them enduring this torture is their devotion to her.
And it's on her terms.
And yeah, exactly. And it's on her terms.
She is coming into these situations. She's not being entirely truthful. She's spinning a web as well as he is spinning a web.
I think initially she wanted it to be devotion, but then when she realized what the audition was, like, she talks about, like, you're setting all these women up for failure. And even if I wasn't the one you picked, all these women that put themselves out there for this role, that they were doomed to fail. So this is what you get. And I know we were talking about the friend being, looking out for him, but I was like rewatching it and watching the audition. And honestly, Michelle, you hit on a note that I had never noticed before until watching it. This, who knows, like the fifth or sixth time, that it's like how similar this is to Tinder and like the dating apps now. And I was like, look at you guys, like looking into the future of what that possibly could have been, or being an influencer at the time. But when I think of the friend and the questions he's asking these women, I mean, this is an audition for a role, but the questions he's asking are so inappropriate and so would not. I mean, maybe in the 90s it would happen, but to listen, it just irks me so much and just makes me gag. And yet she's one of the only ones, because the friend never gets to ask a question. It's all about the guy, because he immediately like saw her picture. She's always in white. She's always this angelic creature. And I do agree that I think that, she associates pain with love and pain with infatuation or some sort of sexual thing or some sort of, but then when she realizes what the audition was, then it becomes, I feel like, a whole different sort of pain for her. It's like, you can enjoy the pain and suffer incredibly. The oxymoron in that. It's like, yeah, and okay.
That's what she's been taught, right?
Yeah, that's what she's been taught.
But I don't think she ever found out that the audition was fake, though.
Well, you say, because I was just like, a lot of the stuff that is revealed as, quote, the truth happens as he's passed out.
Yeah.
Like it's almost like a fantasy and an illusion. But
even in the illusion, he doesn't tell her. He's never transparent about that. He almost does, but then he says that basically, oh, I got something to tell you about the audition. And instead of like telling her what it's actually about, he says, oh, they've canceled it.
Yeah, it probably isn't going to happen.
Yeah. But you could tell he was right on the edge of being transparent about it, and committed one more sin that kind of like potentially put the last nail in his coffin. So.
Or the last needle in his eye.
See, that's the thing. I thought she knew, because she had said, it's like, you set us all up to fail, even though, and then she got to tiki tiki kitty kitty
Right.
kitty kitty thing and all that. So that's why I kind of skipped through until that, because I wanted to know it was like tiki 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 or kitty 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 or whatever it was. I definitely know it's not deeper in Japanese. We all established that.
Oh,
I
sorry.
found that really interesting, and I looked that up today, Katie. And so kiri means quickly.
Quickly.
So I'm not sure if she's repeating quickly, or if she just means like, oh, we'll get this going, or we'll get this over with, or something to that effect. But yeah, I made a point to Google that because I wasn't sure.
And what we're talking about for anybody who's listening is that when she puts the needles in, she does make that kitty 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 noise. And Raul, you had some insight for us.
She had done an interview, and they had specifically asked her about the her saying those words, and that came out of a thing where she was there before they were shooting that scene. She was mumbling the lines to herself, and the director heard her mumble, so they had a conversation about, well, maybe you should mumble some words while that was happening to make it even more scary. And so they decided to do that, and that's where that came from, to do that during that scene, which did make it more scary.
Yeah, because we don't know what she's saying. And on the terrible subtitled version that I got back in 2002, it was said "stick in," like that was the subtitle. I'm like, I don't know what that is. I don't like it. The idea of the man behind the table, at the audition, that is such a power dynamic, right? He can ask anything he wants. And if you want to get the job, you lean into that toxic place. And I agree. I mean, you're listening to some of the things he's asking, but because he opens the door for it, and because he's in that position of, I can grant you this thing, or I can take it away from you. And that is, Japan is a very kind of patriarchal society. So that seems normal. And it's interesting to watch it and be like, that is so fucked up. But it's like, it's been normalized to the point where, like, no, I mean, Dominic and I go into auditions all the time, and that's the deal. Like, you walk in and they are going to judge you, and they know within 2 seconds of you walking in the door whether you're right or wrong for what they need. And then they will sit there and endure you or not,
And then there's the rest of that dog and pony show. If they know already, and then you still have to carry on as if there's another charade that goes on, like if you think if it's a no, then you have to change their mind. And if they've already said yes, you have to convince them then that yes is correct until
Right.
At least you leave the room.
Right. And I think of applying that to the date, that people are on, like, as soon as the guy sits down or the woman sits down, you're like, this is not, but you have to go through the date, you have to enjoy this meal and say goodbye pleasantly. There is that kind of contract of, like, we both have entered into this and we have to go through the motions, and we can't just be like, you know what, you're not right for this. And just end it there. But that so rarely happens in auditions or in dating life.
I think one interesting thing about Asami's character is, like, it's like a reversal of sex fetishes. We talked earlier about how she feeds her boyfriends her puke in a bowl, which is extremely, that to me was like a Miike kind of like thing. It's so transgressive and disgusting, and it's something that most people have never seen. But there are fetish videos. I'm from the old days of the internet where, like, ogrish.com and rotten.com. So I've seen some shit, you know what I'm saying? That's the thing that people pay for to watch for sexual gratification, is women puking in bowls and eating the puke and all that. The fact that she turns around these fetishes onto these men, and she holds the power now, and she subjects them to what they sexualize in women, is, like, super interesting. The fact that in the end she's straddling him sexually, wearing cool black leather mixed with a frilly dress, that's, like, erotic, extremely erotic. And I'm sure it's erotic to her too. She seems to be getting some sort of gratification from it, probably sexual. But it's turned around on him now. She's not the object anymore. He is. She's in control. And I'm not saying it as a good thing, but it's just an interesting, I guess, reversal of power dynamics, because
Yep.
he had all the power over her in the beginning, and now she holds the power over him. And it's just even scarier, I guess, the idea that he's so powerless and he's paralyzed, but he can feel the pain. I know. I just find that extremely fascinating. And the actress, I'll make sure I say her name right, Eihi Shiina. She was in a movie called Tokyo Gore Police after that, where she plays a cop that like fights mutants. That's like the simplest way to describe that movie, but there's like more to it. But it's weird. It's a great film, by the way. Anybody wants to see more of her, go see Tokyo Gore Police. It's fantastic. But she also like has that same kind of aura in that film where she looks beautiful and demure and kind of like delicate, but she's badass and has a sword, and she like a man touches her in her subway and she drags him out of subway and chops his hand off. Like I just love that juxtaposition, that combination in a female character where she looks soft but is actually extremely tough. And she in both of those films she turns around sexual harassment and subjugation onto the men and punishes them for their sins. And I guess I just find it a little intriguing. I guess I know it's like a problematic, I guess, to find a little bit of pleasure in that, but I mean that's what movies are for, if not to explore ideas that you can't in real life, right? So
Well, that was going to be my next question was, I think we are presented with Aoyama as our protagonist. We see the film primarily through his lens. And so ostensibly, he's the person we're supposed to be relating to and sympathetic with. But I'm curious, like, what are people's feelings? I mean, I've heard several people kind of identify him as trash and not a good guy. And so if he's not the person we're relating to, are we relating to Asami? And who are we, quote, rooting for? Or are we just looking at it as this kind of train wreck of relationships and just kind of heightened?
I do think that in a way he's trying to make us connect to her, because he does put in that scene where she gets tortured as a child, and I think that's kind of tries to stir up some sympathy for her, for us. And I think that kind of informs the viewer, like what she's going to do later on. And and when we learn little by little what she has been doing to other men before he meets him, that kind of informs like a sympathy toward her. And then I think toward the end, when they're like both on the ground, I think you kind of have sympathy for both of them, because these are like two very tragic characters.
They were just looking for love.
Yeah, and but they're like, she's kind of like murmuring stuff, and he's kind of rethinking things while they're just laying there. Like he gives like bits and pieces to you to kind of sympathize with, but then at the end, it's just a like super tragic story for both of them.
To yes and what Raul was saying, she has shown that she's suffered great abuse, and then so it would stand to reason that she would then potentially be very sad as an adult. So that makes sense. But the filmmaker makes a very huge point of showing that sadness. I think the most important image to me isn't so much the bag next in front of her that twitches. That's amazing. But also that she's just sitting there, and that this revenge isn't fulfilling her. And it isn't making her whole again. And you really get that super series of disquiet that she still has, and that she's waiting and sitting there in front of the phone, and that she doesn't have any other happiness going on in her life. And that's part of what makes her sympathetic, and maybe just really how someone could very much argue that she's the real character. We just know less about her. The filmmaker chooses also to show us and tell us less about her.
Yeah, and that smile that she gives after sitting for days and days and days. I think it's 2 weeks that go by before he decides to call her on the advice of his friend. He's like, don't call her right away. But yeah, then you see that little smile creep in, and she's just, her head is sunk down. It looks like she might even be asleep, have passed out in front of the phone. And then to see that little smile creep in when the phone finally rings, her efforts have been rewarded.
So this is something that changed for me over the years in terms of how I viewed it. When I first saw it, she was a force of incomprehension. First time I saw it, she was like practically a force of nature. He stepped into the wrong place, and this person that is so damaged that she isn't a human in the same way that we're used to interacting with humans. This thing happened to this guy, and I was totally sympathetic to that guy. I felt like, oh, this family guy who lost his wife and, is devoted to his son and, has friends and stuff. His world basically falls apart because he interacts in the wrong way with the wrong person. And he's too invested in finding love or whatever the idea of this person was before he finds out that she's just a broken, crazy monster. And over time, my thoughts on this have totally changed. And I don't know if it's me that changed or the lens in which I view things because of the way culture changes or what. But now, yeah, absolutely. I see it the way you guys are describing it, where I'm much more sympathetic to her character. I'm much more interested in why she does the things she does and what led to this. And I think all these characters are nuanced. They've got good and bad aspects about them, and she's harder to latch onto. But I also kind of wonder how much of it is I've seen this movie several times. If I were to watch this blind now, would I have that sympathy for her, or do I have to see the horrible ending and have those questions and then come back to it with that lens, trying to understand to see her point of view? I don't know.
Yeah, I'm a big proponent of you can't watch the same movie twice.
Maybe this is because I've been watching a lot of the Menendez brothers stuff that's been on Netflix and all of the other shows, but as far I can understand, and I am sympathetic to the situations that she was in as a child and what she did to the men that inflicted that pain on her and the repercussions that then they endured. However, I can't go along with her then saying because of what happened to her, she's then going to do this to this guy. And this is only the guy that we know. Who knows how long she's been doing this? Because we all know that when that bag twitched and she got that phone call and the look on her face, to me, it wasn't, after watching it and rewatching it, to me, watching that scene now is like, it's like a spider. It's like, and the flies in my web now, because it's like, as soon as she heard that ring, it wasn't immediate, but then that evil smile came on her face. And I was like, damn, this is a beautiful shot.
Yep.
Then she picks it up and then the bag rolls. And that, to me, as an audience member, that is when it's like, okay, it's been a slow burn. I've been with this. I'm trying to see where this is going. And now it's what the fuck is happening? I do not understand. Like, who is this lady and where's this going to go?
That's going to be his reaction too.
Yeah.
He's like, what have I wandered into?
I feel like for me, this audition is kind of like the apex of these female-centered revenge films. I mean, we had a bunch previous to this, and we have things like I Spit on Your Grave, or They Call Her One Eye. I think this was kind of the apex of that. And then after Audition, there was all this slew of other women-led revenge films. The big one to me is Promising Young Women was one that came out during the pandemic, and then they remade I Spit on Your Grave. I mean, there was one called Revenge as well. So I think this movie kind of was like the apex, and then after that, all these other films kind of like followed its lead on these female revenge movies. And not all of them dealt with trauma, and some were just straight up revenge. But I think Audition was really kind of this kicking off this new era of like female-led revenge films.
So yeah, I agree. I think that this is definitely it belongs in that pantheon of great female payback films. But also, Audition was part of not only the J-horror wave of the late 90s, early 2000s, but also it kind of opened up the floodgates for what came to be known as the Asia Extreme movement, where we saw a lot of really explicit gore and over-the-top violence and things like that. I'm curious to hear, what some people's some of their favorite examples of that genre, and also, maybe some other offerings of Miike that people might want to check out. Dominic, you and I were talking the other day about Ichi the Killer, which is, a follow-up to this one.
And so different. just a phenomenally different film, just really just as effective and just as effectively shot and acted, but has the gore has that more you don't laugh at it, but it's kind of amazing and
Yeah,
great.
kind of cartoony.
Yeah, and Audition has none of that. Audition seems like a story that could happen really anywhere.
Michelle?
Yeah, as for another Miike recommendation, I don't know if you guys remember that Masters of Horror series that came out where it had all the different directors, and he did that short film, I guess you could say, called Imprint.
Yep.
Which was like banned forever too. Like it was like so extreme that it was like kind of hard to watch or like see. Like it was hard to watch too, honestly, but it was hard to like find it.
Couldn't find
But
it. Yeah.
it's kind of like if the ending of Audition was the whole movie, basically. It's a geisha, like sex worker type characters torture another one, very explicitly and gruesomely. That's not even honestly an uncommon trope in Japanese horror films. Or like Teruo Ishii does a lot of films like that, where like he literally had like 10 films where it was just different types of torture situations, and it would be like kind of vignettes of like the Yakuza, how do they torture people, or what did they do in the samurai days if somebody did something wrong, how did they torture them, and obviously it was like sexual titillation was involved in it too. But Imprint is like Miike's most intense film on that front. Like a lot of his films have transgressive elements to them, or like violence, like but most of the time it's really over the top and almost cartoonish. But Imprint's like a very almost intimate film where you can tell that some of the characters really like deep down hate another character, and they're like trying to hurt her like as much as they possibly can. It's like a mean film. So I feel like somebody that's into Audition would it would be interesting to watch that one maybe as well, and see how you contrast and compare the two vibes of those two films.
Well, I think kind of a nice marriage of the kind of over the top madness and a more realistic view is Miike's Visitor Q, because that is wildly transgressive and yet is shot kind of in a realistic way. So you get kind of like every taboo that can be broken is broken over the course of that film. But it's a really efficiently made, and it doesn't feel cartoony. It feels like this is the underbelly of polite Japanese society.
The same studio that made Audition had made The Ring.
Mm-hmm.
And so the Audition was like the film after The Ring, and they wanted to stay in this. The Ring was so popular that they wanted to kind of continue, and they did the Audition. The Ring really kicked off that whole kind of J horror.
Right.
After The Ring, there was like The Grudge, and stuff like that. Gozu was one of those in there. It was kind of more
another Miike film.
Yep, Ring, and then Audition really kicked off that era of like extreme J horror.
Yeah, we started seeing like Battle Royale, Suicide Club.
Yeah.
There's also stuff like Meatball Machine Girl.
Yep.
Like I said, Tokyo Gore Police. I can't remember, there was a company, they called it like Sushi Typhoon, I think might have been the name of them.
That sounds right, yeah.
But they were like kind of the same era. I almost want to say perhaps that Japan's films got a little typecast during this era of the early 2000s, where people thought every single Japanese movie ever made was wacky.
Yeah.
Or it was either wacky or like ultra gore, right? And then,
well, and that's
because that's all they brought over.
Exactly. Yeah. That's what you could sell. Like you knew you could package
like it kind
that.
of was maybe detrimental a little bit, perhaps, to Western perception of Japanese film in that era, because that's what everybody thought, and that's what I thought too, because I only had access to what I had access to, and it's not like now where I can access almost anything I want.
Right.
Back then you got what you got. I just find it interesting how like later when I started watching older Japanese films, I'm like, oh, there's all these delicate horror films, ghost films, there's films that aren't wacky at all, and that actually is is a very small amount of their films are actually like wacky like that. It's not as much as you would think it was if you just only saw stuff from 2003 to 2010.
Yeah, well, and if you look at Miike's films, I mean, the man's made over 100 films, but within this lens of like the extreme gore, the extreme horror, that's what we think of when we think of Takashi Miike. If that was your entry point and you haven't done any additional homework of like digging into his Yakuza films or dramas or things like that. When Michelle and I were talking about Tsukamoto for Tetsuo the Iron Man, same kind of thing. Like, we get a certain representation of a director because that's what sells. That's what they can market for us. But that's not necessarily indicative of the artist as a whole.
Films like Saw are direct result of this Asian horror, like extreme Asian horror. I think Saw really takes from that. And then now we got, the Terrifier series, which is like, I think that's all a legacy of this like extreme J horror. That they saw these films and they want to do the same, and so I think this J horror era has left a big mark on what's being shown today.
Well, I mean, in the early 2000s, that's what was happening. Was we got a ton of J horror remakes, like The Grudge remake came out in 2004, which is the same year that we got Saw. So yeah, I think everything was kind of building up to a head, but I also feel like that was maybe going against the 90s, where you couldn't even call a film a horror film. Like, everything had to be a thriller.
Also, it led to, it's the same time period. You got the Korean horror films that are very, very similar, like Old Boy or Hunger or things like that.
My Asian extreme, it's like Battle Royale and Audition. I honestly, other than Audition, I didn't really know the director's work. I wasn't introduced to Ichi the Killer until like years later.
Mm-hmm.
But Old Boy and Memories of Murder, those films, but especially Old Boy with the ending and stuff like that, those are the kind of films, like when I think of Asian extreme, I think of those are like, holy crap, wow, that didn't hold back at all.
Yeah, it's definitely a different taste if you want to go like a culinary comparison. Like, it's unlike anything you've tasted before. And if that's the kind of thing that works for you, you're like, okay, where do I get more of it? And thankfully there was quite an assortment to be picked over during the 2000s. Another one I like is Cold Fish. Sian Sono. Any final thoughts?
I love being exposed to all of this stuff. And I know a lot of it's supposed to be transgressive, but even just little things, watching these movies, you get to see little bits of how people live in that part of the world, and how it contrasts to how we live here. And I know that's not the intention of these films, but it ends up being part of the result. I'm all in for taking you on an extremely out there, edgy, fantasy roller coaster thing, but within the context of also picking up some of the culture in some other place in the world. How do they experience horror, I guess?
Dominic?
Well, I'd just like to end with a question for everybody, like what other Miike films I could take a look at.
Well, I definitely recommend the Dead or Alive trilogy, kind of action-oriented, but also just really wild and over the top, a lot of energy to it. He also did a great samurai film called 13 Assassins, which is kind of a grand scale, spin on the Seven Samurai. Happiness of the Katakuris is a musical, zombie, comedy, family drama. It's wonderful and wild. Visitor Q. And The Great Yokai War is another one of his that I really like.
I always liked Lesson of Evil. I don't know if you guys ever seen that one. It's a thriller, and it's an adaptation of a manga novel. But that's one that I would take a look at if you could even find it. But that's one other than the ones you guys recommended.
It has a Blu-ray. I think Third Window Films might have put it out.
In terms of Audition, the final 20 minutes of it makes it one of the top 10 horror films of all time. Period.
Similar to what Raul said, this is, I think, the definition of slow burn, and it just takes its time. It doesn't, and with so many films these days, we have jump scares and the music and all that stuff, and this one just doesn't have that until you're like more than halfway through the film, and then it's like what? I'm almost asleep, and now that just woke me up, and that was a caffeine shot to my heart. So what is going to happen? And then to just see the extreme of where it goes to, and then when you think that, okay, this is just a dream, we just had like a Dallas moment or something like that, and then you realize it's like that's because his mind is in such pain that he's gone to a different place, and now you're back. It's just unlike any. It really set the pace for, I think, a lot of films that came out 15, 20 years later. I just wish more people, if they have not seen it, had the opportunity to see it. And like me, I wish, they would have more of those shows that like really talk about like the 100 best horror films, so that there are movies that you may not know or you may not have access to. Because that was like me. I had no idea what this film was, heard people talk about it, and now I became obsessed. I've got the pin, I've got the movie, I've got the shirt. I see it in the theater, I see it on TV. And I mean, that's what it's all about. Like, doing stuff like that, doing stuff like this, so that more people can understand and hopefully watch the film and appreciate it.
Thank you. Michelle.
So for my recommendation, I'm going to pick an off-kilter one, which is his adaptation of the video game Ace Attorney.
Yes.
Which is like a video game version of being a lawyer with like anime style. So people have like lawyer attacks, basically special powers, and like one of the lawyers is like psychic, and like it's like amazing. And there's no reason for him to have to like make this movie. Like, why would he adapt that? But that's like how much range this man has, that he does an awesome adaptation of like a video game, and it's like good, which is also rare. Like, there's hardly any good, movies based on games that are good. So Ace Attorney, and also you should just play Ace Attorney. That's like really good. So I'm gonna throw a video game recommendation. Yeah. It's your homework before you watch Ace Attorney, the film. So let me know how that goes. And for overall, I guess I just love this movie, and it was great to revisit it because I hadn't seen it in quite a while, years. And I just loved seeing new things about it, and noticing how masterful the opening is. And a lot of movies nowadays try to do tone switching. And this is one of the very few movies that is absolute masterwork, pitch perfect tone switching, done in a way that isn't that doesn't seem contrived or insisting upon itself. It's perfectly executed, which is, and I also think on a technical level, it's one of his tightest films. Absolutely, start to finish, fantastically done. I think it's honestly like in like the top 3 of all time of his films.
Yeah, and it's funny that at the 2-hour mark, it still doesn't feel like there's a lot of wasted space in there. I think, as we've alluded to throughout the conversation, like it does take a while to build up, but all of that is valuable information. And on a rewatch, all of that pays off later. And so I think it is exactly as long as it needs to be. And I want to just throw out a quick, the source novel by Ryo Murakami is well worth checking out, because this is a relatively faithful adaptation of the novel. And Murakami was also a novelist and a filmmaker. He did a great little film called Tokyo Decadence, which is based on his novel. And I recommend that as well. Miike, on one of the extras on the Arrow Video release, he talks about when Audition was making its rounds in the festival. And after about a year, he's caught up with it again. He was a guest at a festival and he got to see it. And the print was all battered and just like really in bad condition. And he said, wow, you've been to so many places. You've done so, you've touched so many people's lives. And he said it was really great to kind of have it coming back around to him, because this was really the film that launched him on an international level and allowed him to become a household name, at least in, the households that matter. Thank you all so much. What a great conversation. I appreciate everybody lending their voices and their opinions, and looking forward to having you all on again very soon. And until next time, keep searching, keep exploring, and keep sharing the scare.